U.S. Congressman Chuck Edwards convened what he called an anti-crime summit in Asheville last Friday, and on Saturday, 2 people were shot in Pack Square during a Juneteenth celebration. That's the backdrop for today's episode of The Overlook, focusing on North Carolina's evolving gun laws.
One of the biggest shifts in gun legislation this session was Senate Bill 41, which repealed the pistol purchase permit after the governor vetoed the measure.
I'm Matt Peiken, and this is The Overlook, a daily podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. My guest today is investigative journalist Karen Zatkulak, who produced a recent 3-part series on our state's gun laws for WLOS-TV. We talk about the magnitude of the North Carolina legislature doing away with any required permitting to purchase a handgun. We go through the efficacy and differing approaches to background checks, the influence of the NRA, and the absolutism of those who regard the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution as sacrosanct. The Overlook is going live. My first live podcasting event features a conversation with Asheville Symphony music director Darko Buderitz. Black Asheville leaders tell us what they think about the city's commitment and progress toward reparations, and the resident Rogues will talk about and perform songs from their upcoming record. That's 3 episodes of The Overlook in one evening. The Overlook Live happens Wednesday, September 27th at the Wortham Center. Tickets will be $30 when they go on sale to the public, but anyone joining my Patreon campaign in June gets in free. Go to patreon.com/theoverlookpodcast. Karen Zatkulak is a mother of 4, and it's clear she approached her reporting for this series from her perspective as a parent. I began our conversation by asking whether that was a conscious editorial decision.
You're exactly right. That was the point of the story, or the thought behind the series. You hear about these school shootings, these mass shootings, and as a parent, you can't help but fear for your children, right? You can't help but think, what if it happens here? And every time another one happens, it's just hard not to get so upset with so many happening so frequently. So I reached out to my manager and said, I think we need to just do an in-depth look at our gun laws. What are they? What do they say? How are they changing? Who's behind them? Who and what is framing the access to guns in our state? Because ultimately, in my mind, that could play a role in who gets access to these guns and if these shootings were to happen here in Western North Carolina.
Now, you're approaching this not from the vapors of a crisis happening in our area. Usually this kind of reporting happens when there's been a mass shooting in a school or some other public setting. You just had this general question. Did you find in your reporting and in reaching out to people that people were more open to talking about things and being more candid? Legislators will talk about what you heard from them in a little bit. But did you find overall that coming about this not on the heels of a crisis, but just with general questions, were people more forthcoming and more revelatory about information you received?
I think yes and no. I think there was definitely some of that. People aren't, as you said, expecting those phone calls from the media when we've had a big crisis like this in our area. So I think there was a little bit more, okay, you just want to know the information. You're not trying to base it off of what just happened. You're just looking for information and to educate the public. So I think people were a little bit more willing to talk in that respect. Also, obviously, there had been a pretty big change in our state's gun laws recently. So a lot of it focused around that. And I think people were a little bit more willing to talk about that. But as gun laws is divisive, especially right now, and I think, and I clarified and tried to in all of my interviews for all of the stories, make this not a political conversation. Let's get the information, because I did find that there's a lot, and I think there is in general, a lot of misinformation, just a lot of lack of knowledge of what you are and aren't allowed to do, how to buy a gun, what the laws say, what the rules are here in our state, how it differs from other states. A lot of that, I think, is just information that people don't think about, or maybe don't realize, they don't clearly understand.
Or they think about, but they don't have the answers. They just wonder about those things. You mentioned a gun law that was a turning point in this state Go into detail about that. What happened?
Yeah, so that was Senate Bill 41. That was passed back in the end of March, so this legislative session. And that took away the requirement for a purchase permit for a pistol, for a handgun, right? So before, you had to go to the sheriff's office, apply for a permit in order to buy any type of handgun, wait for the sheriff's office to do their background check. They did that background check. They completed it. It could take weeks in some counties, months, just depending on the backlog for that specific sheriff's office. And then once they got you that permit back, then you could go to a gun store and buy a gun. That all went away. And now you can just go into a gun store and they will run a background check on you through a national database online. And then within literally seconds, you can get that back, be approved, and go ahead and buy either a long gun or a handgun, because that purchase permit isn't required in our state and wasn't previously for something like a rifle or a shotgun. But that was a pretty big change. I was a little bit surprised. I reached out to all of the sheriffs in Western North Carolina, and only 2 were willing to speak with us. Well, I should say 3, 1 sent a statement, but 2 were willing to sit down with us, and they were on differing sides of the argument. One sheriff supported this repeal and one sheriff did not.
Talk about the sheriff who supported the repeal. I think that's interesting for a sheriff who's charged with enforcing laws and keeping the peace in their community, that would be okay with anybody being able to purchase a gun without that sort of oversight. What was the argument there?
Yeah, so he said that for him, first of all, I think it's a big burden on the sheriff's office to do these background checks. So for him, it was, and in his mind, a bit repetitious, that he felt like this national background check was just as good as the background check that an employee with his department could do. And so basically he said, it frees up a whole employee for me, because this person was working basically a full-time job doing these background checks. Now the gun stores do it. In my mind, the background checks they do are just as good as what we did, and it gives me an extra employee. It frees up space in my office for storing these files, these permit applications. So for him, I think it was just a weight off of him resource-wise, because as we know, a lot of these local sheriff's offices are already understaffed and don't have enough resources. And so it was a good thing for him. And he feels like he can trust these gun stores to run these background checks, do what they need to do, and only give guns to the people who should have them.
So to be clear, gun stores or anybody selling a gun in this state has to conduct a background check?
That's right.
Does that also apply to gun shows? I see those advertised where they're maybe at some big convention.
Expo Center,
yes.
Yeah, so if most gun stores are federally licensed to sell guns, and so those would be the ones that would be there. Now, private sales, if I wanted to sell you a gun, obviously that I don't have to do a background check. So the private sales is not included in this. This is for those gun stores that are licensed federally to sell guns, and they do have to use this national background check. But again, and it is considered the best background check that you can get. It's the NICS system. It's supposed to look at all the different factors, federal things, other states, looks at everything, looks at your whole record. I was shocked that when I went into a gun store and went through the process myself, it was literally seconds that it takes.
Yeah, I thought that was great that you went through the process yourself of buying a gun. And you said it takes seconds. How comprehensive can this background check be if it literally can happen while you're in the store?
The point of it, I guess, is that it's very up to date. So it's looking at all of your records, everything, and it's updating it constantly. There is a staff with this NICS database that works 24/7. If a gun store has a question, they can call. Someone's always there to answer the phone, and it just automatically updates within the system and runs through every single database it has to see, and then says. And the other thing is, my last name is Zatkulak, so it was a very unique last name. So that also didn't take as much time because I'm not a Karen Smith, right? So I think, and while we were at the store, there were other people who were applying for or interested in buying a gun, and their background checks were taking maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. So I think that it can take a little bit longer. It depends on your name, how common it is. And if there is any sort of issue, if there's any red flag, it comes back with a delay. And then there's a couple of days waiting period where National Database does a deeper dig into this person, and that can take some more time. But if you're clean, if you have no criminal history, if you have a very unique last name, it can come back very quickly.
And just for context, you also found that only 10 states have these sort of permit laws in place where it has to happen.
That's right. Yeah. And so we went through, in our second piece, we went through a lot of comparisons of which states have what, kind of where we rank. And I also didn't realize North Carolina at Duke University has a Center for Firearms Law. This is what they do. And this is a unique facility in the whole country to have a firearms law location like this.
But explain this a little bit. A firearms law, is it a law center where they come up with laws or draft? What is this?
These are lawyers associated with Duke University, and they do tons of research. They are looking into the historical information on how these laws have changed, what they look like in the past. They go through and will look at, say, this recent pistol permit repeal here in North Carolina, maybe 10 years down the road. They'll go back and look at this and say, okay, how did that play out in the court system? When that changed, were things changing, and how did that happen, and who had to face charges because of this? They just look at all the repercussions of changing laws.
So they're
throughout our state.
So they're researching not just, or is it North Carolina centric? So they're researching the history of gun laws and the efficacy or the impact of them?
Exactly.
Have you found, in talking with them, what have you found in terms of a trend? I saw some allusion to, here's what the laws were in 1990, and how have we either progressed, regressed, become more strict or more liberal in our gun laws?
Yeah, I think that was their point, was that it swings back and forth. There are trends where we go one way, and then there's trends where we go the other, and it happens cyclically every couple of decades. But he was saying 40 years ago, by our standards, our laws would be very permissive right now. This just wasn't the way it was back then. But so much of this changes based on the political situation currently. And yeah, it was interesting to hear his perspective, and also how this is all based on, or should be based on, what our founding fathers meant when they created this, and our interpretation of that, and how really now it is up to the courts, but also the policymakers, the lawmakers, and how they're interpreting that.
It was interesting to me, the voices of Republicans who were very much, I guess you would call them pro-Second Amendment legislators. And between the two of them, they articulated to you, I think, the essence of this chasm we have between people who want to see tighter gun laws and people who want to see them loosened. And you quoted Jake Johnson as saying it's black and white, and it's in the Constitution. So his view is almost as an originalist. This is what it says, and that the right to bear arms, end, stop, period. That's that. And that you had Mark Pless say guns are not the issue, it's a mental health issue. Both of these, to me, and Karen, comment about this, those arguments, nobody can counter that. There is no counter. It's whether it's what you post a belief in, and whether you want to address guns as an issue or not rests on entirely your belief system.
That's absolutely right. And it's very interesting. It's interesting to talk to both of these sides. One of the Democrats that I talked to said, the interesting thing to me is that it's almost like we're living in two different worlds. It's really one of those issues that it's like you just cannot see what the other side is thinking. And I feel like, for me as a journalist, I feel like there's often times where I can understand both sides, right? You can see a little bit of both perspectives. You can understand what someone's train of thought is. But with this, it really felt like both sides here just cannot see anything on the other side. It's so one side or the other to me.
I don't know if it's so much that they can't see it, but they believe that if they listen and give credence to any other side, it's giving too much of an inch in this tug of war, and that any inch leads to capitulation. That's what it seems like to me. Let's talk about the mental health side of things, because these background checks, they don't check for mental health, do they?
It depends on which ones you're speaking of. But yes, that was Sheriff Quentin Miller's point when we talked to him, was that there are things that are going to be missed. He gave us the numbers. He provided the information from last year, how many permits they granted, and he said there was 63 that would have been denied, and that they denied, and 54 of those would not have been caught in this new system. So he's basically saying, look, there's a large number of these that we denied that if this new system was in place then, those 54 people would have been given a gun.
Wait, you're saying the new system, this NICS system.
Exactly.
So even though you just said a little while ago, this is the most comprehensive that we have, there's a general belief that this federal system is the best we can do, and that any sort of search, background check happening at the local level is either repetitious or not as good as that. And yet, you said Quentin Miller talked about how 63 permits that were denied, 54 of them that NICS would not have caught. What does that say?
Yeah, so he's saying that there are certain mental health, like you have an involuntary commitment to a mental health facility for 2 or 3 days. That's something that would not necessarily pop up on the NICS system. And that's something that could be nothing, but could be something bigger. And that's something that someone, a human being in the sheriff's office who is knowledgeable maybe with particular people in the community, or just sees that someone might have gone in for an involuntary commitment like that, maybe multiple times, and it didn't pop up on the record, but they can see that in their research, they might deny someone a pistol permit purchase because of that.
Do any of these mental health background checks check for domestic disputes? If any of these people are coming from home situations where somebody has called the police because of violent threats?
That's the other big point that Sheriff Miller made, that some of those, it just depends on how far it escalated. It might be something that have made it to the court system and is in your record, but maybe not. The other thing that they mentioned is some of this should be in, but that's depending entirely on clerks putting all of this information into the national database system. That's a lot of relying on people to put every single bit of info into a system, and perhaps something gets missed. Perhaps something gets put under the wrong John Smith. There's a little bit of a room for error, and in Sheriff Miller's mind, why not err on the side of caution? Why not have a human being, a person in the sheriff's office making those phone calls themselves, looking at those records themselves, rather than relying on a national database to do it for you?
One of the things that I'm perplexed about is for the people, legislators and others who favor absolute gun rights, what harm is there to wait for a little while for a more comprehensive check that would allow for mental health check, a more comprehensive mental health check? And so instead of getting a gun instantaneously, they have to wait several days, maybe a week or longer. But if they pass it, they still get the gun. What's the rush? What is the response to that?
I asked that very question, and the response is, it is my right to have that gun immediately. And if I feel like I need to defend myself this weekend, I should be able to get that gun right now.
Wow. And this also speaks to the definition of defense. We're in an increasing age of stand your ground laws. Mm-hmm. We don't have one yet, but you see this kind of legislation in Florida, other places, and it mushrooms up. So what did you learn in your reporting that I imagine you already had some ideas and sense of what you were walking into? What did you learn that you found surprising or galling or shocking?
Oh, there was a lot. I think one of the things was I didn't realize this scope, and maybe this is just because I haven't looked into it as much, but there are so many different categories and things to look at when you're looking at gun laws. The minimum age, where you can carry, how you can purchase, what you can purchase, how long it takes, the background checks, the storage laws, the safety, all different types of things. And I think in my mind, I'm a black and white person. I wanted, okay, North Carolina ranks 20th out of 50 states or wherever we are, right? And this is what we are. It's not that simple to say that. And even when I was talking to the person at Duke, he said there's just so many different things to look at. And he felt like we were sort of in the middle, more on the permissive side when it comes to our gun laws, especially after this recent pistol purchase permit repeal. But there is just so much to look at and so much information. And even in talking with people and talking about these stories within the community, a lot of people don't know. Oh, I didn't know that you could just walk in and buy. I didn't know that the purchase permit wasn't a law anymore. I think there's a lot of lack of information unless you're someone who wants to buy a gun, is very interested in that. I think that a lot of people don't realize a lot of the laws surrounding this.
And also the type of guns that are permitted and aren't. You mentioned the age requirement, and North Carolina, is there an age requirement?
It's 18 for long guns, shotguns, rifles, but 21 for pistols. And that's a big debate. And in some states, it's 21 for all guns. So I think that's another big sticking point. But of course, here, we've got a lot of hunters. We're in the South, and we're in an area where I think a lot of people associate that with hunting. And one of the Democrats that I interviewed said, look, I was raised hunting as a child. This is something that I grew up with. And that was the other interesting thing, too. Even a lot of the Democrats said, look, if you look at the North Carolina legislature and the lawmakers here, a lot of them carry guns. A lot of them want guns and want gun rights, but we just want to make sure they're in check. We just want to make sure that they're appropriate common sense laws. And that's, I think, where the divide comes, is that a lot of folks on the Republican side just can't get past any tightening or any restrictions on access to guns.
I am an American woodsman, my fortune for to seek. I am an American woodsman, as plain as day can be.
Naturalist John J. Audubon has his life and work put to music in The American Woodsman, getting its world premiere at the Wortham Center for the Performing Arts. Asheville playwright and director Lori Pandy built the story and songs from Audubon's journals. A cast of operatic vocalists and a live musical duo brings them all to life. The American Woodsman opens June 23rd and runs 8 performances through July 2nd. For tickets and more information, go to worthamarts.org. How much of this would you connect to NRA support to our legislators? One of the things you found, which I found eye-opening, was that our U.S. senators, Tom Tillis and Ted Budd, they were both in the top 10 of NRA contributions, and that Tom Tillis in particular, he was number 2. He's received $5.6 million throughout his career from the NRA. How much of this is dictated by national policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we reached out to both. We did not hear back from Senator Tillis, but we did hear back from Senator Budd, who said very point blank, I am a strong believer in Second Amendment rights, and that happened way before the NRA endorsed me, before they gave me any money. This is something that I believe in, and I'm going to vote this way regardless of whether the NRA is giving me money or not. Obviously, that's something that you can interpret as you will. But even the local Republicans that we interviewed who were endorsed by the NRA said, yeah, they endorse us, but they know that I'm going to vote this way regardless of whether they give me money or not. This is just my belief system. This is what I believe, and this is what my constituents, why they voted me in, and this is what I'm going to stand behind. One of them, the quote you brought up earlier from Jake Johnson, the black and white, this is in the Constitution. My question to him was, as a parent who sees these school shootings and is horrified that something like this is going to happen to your child, how do you put your rights to own a gun above that? And that was his answer. It's black and white in the Constitution. This is be all end all. This is what we should be believing in and the way that our laws should be constructed above the safety aspect for our children.
Yeah, and the next breath is what you heard, in a sense, from Mark Pless, is that guns aren't issues, mental health. Okay, so if such a crisis were to happen in our schools or somewhere else in public, it's a shame we didn't get to them in a mental health standpoint before this happened. Is there a way to frame mental health with gun ownership? Is there a way, because you said that is allowed in certain background checks. That does happen. But are these legislators wanting to divorce mental health checks from gun acquisition?
I don't think so, but I think Mark Pless is the very next question I asked him when he said this is a mental health thing. I said, then why don't we look at mental health? Why don't we put more funding there? And he said, we're working on it. That's a very complicated question. Nobody knows the answer to how to fix that. But I think that's something you hear over and over again is we need to address the mental health side of things. That's an obvious thing, but how do we do that? That's going to be something that's you're gonna have different opinions on depending on the side of the aisle you are. But I think that everyone agrees that's a big piece of this. It's just how do we solve that and how do we intricate that into our gun laws?
I've heard, and this is just through reading, I don't know if it's quantifiable, that a majority of gun owners want to see what we call common sense gun legislation. If that is true, where is the chasm here between what gun owners are even open to as in terms of a majority versus what legislators are putting through?
That's a good question. And I've read that same stat that a lot of people, even gun owners, yes, want more common sense gun laws. And the Democrats keep bringing that up as well. And the Republicans just say that that's not true. Their constituents here in Western North Carolina want no restrictions on their gun access.
You found that one of the things you found is that only 20 states have what are called red flag laws. Describe a red flag law, and why does North Carolina not have one?
Yeah, so that's something that is going to alert folks that, or just put a holding period. If there's any sort of issue, any sort of problem that could make it so that someone should not get a gun, right? Anything in their background, anything that's happened. They're also called extreme risk laws. So any person that maybe let's give it a little minute and take some time and see if this person really should buy a gun, just that extra added protection, and North Carolina doesn't have one. There's been several bills proposed this session on this very issue. And again, it goes back to the Republicans not wanting to put any extra, I think, and talking to some of them, one of the arguments I heard was that it puts more discretion on perhaps the sheriff or the person issuing those permits, that maybe they just don't want to issue any more purchase permits.
The people who are gun advocates, correct me if I'm wrong on distilling it this way, that they're saying we don't want to leave the discretion in the hands of sheriffs who may not be responsible, might have another agenda here. We want a uniform set of laws that everybody goes by.
Exactly.
You also found that only 10 states have assault weapons bans. I just found that really stunning. What is the argument? Apparently 40 of our 50 states think it's perfectly fine to have assault weapons out on the street. Did you talk with our legislators about their support or lack thereof for assault weapons?
Yeah, that was definitely something I brought up with several of them, because that was shocking to me as well, that only 10 states had that. And it's the same answer. It's a gun. It's a weapon. We have a right to have it.
The concealed carry, North Carolina is one of 23 states with a concealed carry law. I don't know, from my vantage, I would like a reveal and carry, not concealed carry. I want to see who's carrying the gun, just so I know I don't want to go near that person or whatever. What is the thought of concealed carry?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, they don't want everyone to know. They don't want that target on their back if something should happen, to know that they have a weapon. But yeah, that was an interesting one. And so Mark Plus actually was one of the sponsors of a bill, Freedom to Carry NC, which was very controversial this session. It didn't end up passing, but that would have done away with our concealed carry permit system here in North Carolina. And it would make us what's called a constitutional carry state, where basically it's in the Constitution. We have every right to carry a gun concealed.
Wait, Mark Plus proposed that. He wrote that bill. It didn't pass. Why do you think that didn't pass? We have a super majority of Republicans in our state house.
He alluded to the fact that they were very happy with the purchase permit repeal, and I think they knew that was big to get that through, and there would have been a lot of pushback for this Freedom to Carry NC.
A lot of pushback from who? Who would have pushed back?
I think they just knew that in the grand scheme of the current political situation, yes, they probably could have passed it, but I think there was some Republicans perhaps who even wouldn't have been totally on board with this, because that's a big step to do away. Right now, the concealed carry permit in North Carolina, it involves an enhanced background check, an 8-hour physical class where you have to go, there's a legal exam, there's a shooting proficiency, you have to hit the target this many times. So it's a pretty involved process to get a concealed carry permit, and it takes time. Again, that goes through the sheriff's office. There's a bit of a backlog, but I think to do away with that or to make it less of a burden to get that permit would have been very controversial.
In a way, I can see the sense in the distinction between just the purchase permit, loosening that where you're allowed to own a gun, I guess, have it in your house,
right,
versus being allowed to take it out in public. Is that the difference here?
Yeah.
Does the concealed carry, does it allow you, or without the concealed carry, just having this gun purchase permit, can you have it in your car? Are there places you can have your gun just not on your person in public?
So you just can't, yes, it can't be concealed. It can't be on your person where the general public can't see it. But yes, you can carry a gun, you can have it in your car, you can have it in your home, just with a regular permit. Yeah.
If you're not concealing it, Can you just carry a gun without that permit? Are you allowed?
In certain places.
Really? Yeah. Like where? Like church? Because I saw that in your story.
The sensitive places laws.
Sensitive places.
So we do have some of those in North Carolina, but again, there's a very broad spectrum of where guns are allowed and not allowed. Schools, government buildings, that's not allowed here. And that was another. I was very surprised at how many bills were proposed. I think I counted 18 this session just around different types of gun laws and all the nuances of changing where you can carry. Can you carry it in a school if it's not school hours? If it's, say, a church setting on a Sunday, so school's not in session, but it's a school building. There's lots of different ways you can kind of interpret these and change things. And so there was a lot that was on the table this session. I think that the purchase permit repeal was the one big thing that happened. I think that after that was the end of it for this session.
It sounds like that this is an ongoing, evolving topic of law and lawmakers. Where do you see this going? In your reporting it through it, are you seeing that, given the makeup of our legislature, that we're just going to keep seeing more bills that loosen gun laws?
I think that's definitely a possibility. I think that any Democrat who you talk to today would be honest and say, yeah, it's a frustrating, hopeless situation right now because we are definitely not going to pass any law that tightens gun access right now in the current setting. And I said, how do you go in and propose bills and spend time on these that you know are not going to go anywhere? And they said, that's what we have to do. That's what we've been charged to do as an elected official. And we just have to believe that someday the situation is going to change and one day we're going to be back in the majority and maybe things will pass.
You entered this reporting, this series, as a parent. That was your initial basis for questions. Where does this leave you as a parent? You have young kids, and how did you feel, or how do you feel about where we're at with our gun laws and our access to guns now as a parent? You have 4 young kids. How do you feel?
It's a little bit frightening if you let yourself go down that path of knowing that I, as a person, again, like you, who could never have shot a gun in my life, can walk into a store and very quickly buy a gun, any gun really that you want. If you think that way, it does start to get a little bit depressing and your head can go in a negative space. But I also think that you have to rely on the system in some way. You have to just say, this is what we have. This is what our elected officials have put in place. And you have to trust that the people that are supposed to do their jobs to protect us are doing that. That the people on both sides are thinking about safety, are trying to think about how we can both balance the Constitution and also make sure that our citizens are safe. And I do think there is a lot of that going on, but it's a tricky situation. I think, unfortunately, you just can't let yourself go to the what ifs. You have to send your children to school. Summer now, thank goodness, but you just have to send your kids and hope that everybody's doing what they can to protect the people around them.
I want to thank my guest today, Karen Zatkulak of WLOS-TV. And by the way, we will have links to her 3-part series in the description for this episode. Today's conversation happened inside the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which owners Susan and Giles Collard have been so gracious enough to open to me to record my interviews. Our theme music for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes courtesy of the Asheville band The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes are online by 6 a.m. every weekday wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at podavl.com. And please support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. I'm Matt Peiken, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook.